It was one of those chilly autumn afternoons, the kind where the sun struggles to peek through the thick layer of clouds, casting everything in a soft grey light. The streets were busy with people rushing around, their collars turned up against the wind, bags in hand, each person lost in their own world. Amid the crowd, one man moved differently, slowly, cautiously, with a white cane tapping in front of him. He was clearly blind, but what stood out even more was the look of quiet determination on his face, as though he'd done this countless times before. The world around him may have been a blur of sounds and sensations, but he navigated it with practiced ease. As he made his way down the sidewalk, his cane tapping rhythmically, a few people gave him quick glances but hurried past. It was as if they saw him, yet didn't see him, perhaps too busy or uncomfortable to stop. But then, from across the street, someone did notice. Marcus, a tall, kind-hearted black man in his early 30s, had been waiting at the crosswalk when he saw the man. Dressed in simple clothes, Marcus exuded a quiet confidence. He was used to blending in, keeping to himself, but something about the blind man struggling to find the curb caught his attention. It wasn't just the man's obvious need for help, it was the way everyone else seemed to look right past him. Without a second thought, Marcus crossed the street, dodging the light traffic, and approached the man. "Hey, excuse me," he called out softly, not wanting to startle him. The man paused, his head turning slightly toward Marcus's voice. "You look like you could use a hand. Can I help you get where you're going?" The blind man smiled, a bit surprised. "That would be great, thank you," he said, his voice warm and grateful. "I'm trying to get to the bus stop, but I keep missing it by a few feet. It's tricky when you can't see the signs." Marcus nodded, even though he knew the man couldn't see him. "No problem at all. I'll walk you there." As they made their way down the street together, Marcus struck up a conversation, keeping it light. The man introduced himself as Richard, a retired school teacher who had lost his sight later in life due to an illness. Despite the obvious challenges, Richard had a surprisingly upbeat attitude, making jokes and telling stories about his teaching days. "You know, I never imagined I'd end up like this," Richard said with a chuckle, tapping his cane on the ground for emphasis. "But life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it?" Marcus smiled at that, though something about Richard's words struck a chord with him. Life had certainly surprised Marcus in more ways than one. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, surrounded by hardships, but had always strived to rise above them. Helping people, even strangers, was something he did naturally. It was part of who he was. As they neared the bus stop, something shifted in the air. Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt a subtle tension creeping in. The street, which had been busy moments ago, now seemed oddly quiet. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a group of young men standing a little too close for comfort. Watching them from across the street, Marcus's instincts kicked in, but he kept his voice calm as he continued chatting with Richard. He didn't want to alarm him. "You've got a great sense of humor, Richard. I'm sure your students loved you," Marcus said, his tone light, though his eyes kept flicking back to the group. Richard chuckled, oblivious to the potential danger. "Oh, they were a handful, but they kept me young. I miss those days sometimes." Suddenly, one of the men from the group started walking toward them. Marcus tensed, his mind racing. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he had a bad feeling. The man was getting closer, his posture tense and aggressive. Marcus knew he had to protect Richard, who was completely unaware of what was unfolding around them. "Richard," Marcus said quietly, his voice low but urgent, "I think we should keep moving." Before Richard could respond, the man was in front of them, blocking their path. "Hey," the stranger sneered, eyeing Marcus up and down. "What's a guy like you doing helping someone like him?" The tone in his voice was unmistakable, and Marcus's heart pounded. He knew where this was going, and it wasn't good. Marcus's heart raced as he stood face to face with the stranger, who was now glaring at him with a smug expression. "Richard," still unaware of the tension, tilted his head slightly, as if sensing that something had shifted. The man's words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. "What's a guy like you doing helping someone like him?" Marcus remained calm on the outside, but inside, his instincts were screaming. With situations like this, before people making judgments based on appearance, assuming things without even knowing him. But this wasn't the time or place to get into an argument. Richard was vulnerable, and Marcus knew he had to de-escalate the situation, for both their sakes. "Just lending a hand," Marcus replied, keeping his tone light, though his eyes never left the man in front of him. "That's all. No harm in helping someone out." The man didn't move, his posture aggressive as he sized Marcus up. The group of men from across the street seemed to be watching closely, almost like they were waiting for something to happen. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, but he kept his focus on the man in front of him, determined to stay calm. Richard, sensing the tension but still unsure of the details, spoke up. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady but confused. The man scoffed, his eyes flicking toward Richard briefly, before landing back on Marcus. "No problem," he said, though the tone of his voice suggested otherwise. "Just making sure everything's fair." Marcus knew what that meant. He'd seen this kind of thing before, people looking for a reason to stir up trouble, using thinly veiled words to hide their real intentions. But he wasn't about to let this escalate, not with Richard depending on him. "Everything's fine," Marcus said, his voice firm but still calm. "We're just heading to the bus stop." For a long moment, the man didn't move, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether or not to push further. Marcus held his ground, not backing down, but also not giving him any reason to take things to the next level. Finally, the man smirked, stepping aside just enough to let them pass. "Yeah, sure. Whatever you say," he muttered, though there was an edge to his words that left Marcus on high alert. Marcus didn't wait for another word. He gently guided Richard forward, his hand resting lightly on the older man's arm, steering him away from the potential danger. His heart was still pounding, but he kept his steps steady, not wanting to show any sign of weakness or fear. As they moved down the street, Marcus could feel the weight of the group's stares on his back, but he didn't look back. He kept his focus on Richard, who still seemed a bit confused, but was trusting Marcus to guide him safely. "That was strange," Richard said after a few moments of silence, his voice thoughtful. "I didn't catch all of it, but something didn't feel right." Marcus hesitated for a moment, not wanting to worry Richard more than necessary. "Just a guy with too much time on his hands," he said with a small smile, trying to brush it off. "Nothing to worry about." But Richard wasn't easily convinced. He had been around long enough to know when something wasn't quite right. People like that, they always seem to think they've got something to prove, don't they? He mused, his tone reflective. Marcus nodded, even though Richard couldn't see him. "Yeah, something like that," he agreed, though his mind was still racing with thoughts of what had just happened. They reached the bus stop a few minutes later, and Marcus helped Richard find a seat on the bench. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, but for now, they seemed to be out of immediate danger. Marcus glanced around, his eyes scanning the street for any signs that the men had followed them, but it looked clear. "For now, thanks again for your help," Richard said, pulling Marcus out of his thoughts. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. People don't usually stop to help these days." Marcus smiled, though his mind was still half focused on the events of the last few minutes. "No problem at all. I'm just glad I could help." Richard shifted on the bench, tilting his head as if he were trying to get a better sense of Marcus. "You seem like a good guy," he said after a pause. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Marcus shrugged, feeling a bit uncomfortable with the praise. "It's nothing really. Just doing what anyone else would have done." But Richard shook his head. "No, it's not nothing. I've been out here long enough to know that people don't always do the right thing. They look the other way, pretend they don't see." But you didn't. That means something. Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he simply nodded, appreciating the older man's words, but not feeling like he deserved any special recognition. Helping others was just something he did. It wasn't about being a hero, just about being human. After a few minutes, the bus pulled up, and Marcus helped Richard stand. As he guided him toward the door, something caught his eye. Across the street, standing in the shadow of a building, was the man from earlier, watching them. His arms were crossed, and there was a look on his face that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He didn't make a move, just stood there, his eyes locked on Marcus and Richard as they boarded the bus. Marcus quickly ushered Richard inside, not wanting to alarm him. Once they were seated, Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. That guy wasn't done. He could feel it. There was something about the way he'd stood there, watching them, that told Marcus this wasn't over. Richard, blissfully unaware of the man's presence, started talking about his day, telling Marcus stories about the different people he'd encountered on his walks around the city. But Marcus was only half listening, his thoughts focused on what might come next. As the bus pulled away from the stop, Marcus glanced out the window, half expecting to see the man following them. But the street was empty, and the man was nowhere to be seen. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. What was this guy's problem? Why had he targeted them? And more importantly, what was he planning to do next? As the bus rumbled down the street, Marcus tried to push the thoughts aside. He had done what he could to help Richard, and now it was time to move on. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. The man wasn't just going to let it go. The rest of the ride passed uneventfully, with Richard continuing to talk, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the tension Marcus still felt. When they finally reached Richard's stop, Marcus helped him off the bus and guided him toward his apartment building. "Thanks again, Marcus," Richard said as they reached the entrance. "You've been a real lifesaver today." Marcus smiled, though the weight of what had happened earlier still hung over him. "Glad I could help, Richard. You take care of yourself, okay?" Richard chuckled. "I will. Don't you worry about me." Marcus watched as Richard disappeared into the building, feeling a sense of relief that he had gotten the man home safely. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something told him that the man from earlier wasn't done with them yet. And Marcus had no idea just how right he was. As Marcus walked away from Richard's apartment, the uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger. He couldn't shake the image of the man standing across the street, watching them with that cold, calculating stare. It had been hours since the incident, but Marcus felt like something was still lurking just beneath the surface. The city around him seemed to hum with an unseen tension, and every noise, every shadow, felt like a threat waiting to materialize. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the guy was just trying to intimidate him, to prove some point. But deep down, Marcus knew it wasn't that simple. This man wasn't just some random troublemaker. There was more to this, and Marcus feared he was about to find out what. It was getting dark by the time Marcus got back to his neighborhood, the familiar streets dimly lit by flickering streetlights. The day's events replayed in his mind as he walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. He hadn't told anyone what had happened, mostly because he didn't want to worry anyone. But as much as he tried to downplay it in his own mind, the sense of dread wouldn't leave him. Just as Marcus reached his apartment building, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something made him pause. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Hello?" he said cautiously. There was a brief silence on the other end before a voice, low and unfamiliar, spoke. "You should minded your own business." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was him, the man from earlier. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm bells going off in his head. "You think you can just walk away after what you did?" The man replied, his tone dark, almost mocking. "You made a mistake. And now, you're gonna pay for it." Marcus's heart pounded as he scanned the street around him, looking for any sign of the man. Was he close by? Was he watching him right now? "I don't know who you are," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the tension building inside him. "But if you're trying to scare me, it's not going to work." The man let out a low chuckle, sending chills down Marcus's spine. "You think this is about fear?" he asked. "You'll understand soon enough. This isn't over." Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, frozen for a moment, gripping his phone tightly. His mind raced with questions. Who was this guy? What did he want? And why was he targeting Marcus for helping a blind man? None of it made any sense, but the threat was real. Marcus quickly made his way into his apartment building, locking the door behind him as he entered his small, quiet space. The walls, which had always felt like a refuge after a long day, now seemed to close in around him. He could feel the weight of the man's words hanging in the air, taunting him. He paced the room, trying to think through his next steps. Should he call the police? But what would he tell them that some guy was harassing him after a random encounter on the street? There wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence. And Marcus had no idea what this man was truly capable of. The next few days passed in a blur, each one filled with an underlying tension that Marcus couldn't shake. He went about his normal routine work, errands, everything he usually did, but it all felt different now. Every time he stepped outside, he found himself looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next move. Then one evening, as Marcus was leaving work, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Parked across the street, in the shadow of a dimly lit alley, was a black car. It wasn't the car itself that unsettled him. It was the person sitting inside. Though he could barely make out the figure through the windshield, Marcus knew who it was. The man from before. Marcus's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had no proof the man was following him, at least, not yet. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was unmistakable. He turned and started walking, keeping his pace casual, despite the panic building inside him. His mind raced with options. Should he confront the man? Call the police? Or try to lose him? The car didn't move as Marcus walked, but the presence of it, so close yet so silent, was enough to make his heart pound in his chest. He took a deep breath, turning down a side street, hoping the narrow alleyways would give him some cover. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he saw the car's headlights flicker on. It was following him. Marcus picked up his pace, his footsteps echoing against the empty streets as he tried to think through his next move. He needed to get somewhere public, somewhere with people. The last thing he wanted was to be caught alone in some dark corner of the city with this guy. But the streets were eerily empty, and with each passing second, the car seemed to close the distance between them. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he turned down another street, hoping to lose the car in the maze of side roads. But no matter which way he turned, the car was right there, its slow, deliberate movements matching his every step. Suddenly, Marcus saw a glimmer of hope, a small diner at the corner of the street, its neon sign flickering in the night. The place looked run down, but there were people inside. He could see a couple of customers through the windows, hunched over their meals. Without hesitating, Marcus made a beeline for the diner, pushing through the door with a sense of urgency. Inside, the warm glow of the diner lights felt like a temporary shield against the darkness outside. Marcus slid into a booth near the window, keeping his eyes on the street. The car had stopped just down the block, its engine idling, as if waiting for him to make the next move. "Can I get you something, hon?" a waitress asked, her voice cutting through Marcus's tense thoughts. He nodded, not even sure what he wanted. "Just coffee, please," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on car outside. The waitress disappeared behind the counter, leaving Marcus alone with his racing thoughts. The man in the car wasn't going away. He was patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. But why? What had Marcus done to deserve this kind of attention? As the coffee arrived, Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His stomach tightened as he stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Finally, he swiped the screen and held the phone to his ear. "You're not as smart as you think," the voice said, low and threatening. "Running into a diner? You can't hide forever." Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want from me?" "You'll find out soon enough," the man replied, his tone dripping with malice. "But first, I want to make sure you understand something. Helping that old man, it was a mistake. You should just walked away." Marcus's mind raced. This was about Richard. The man hadn't just been targeting him, he had something against Richard too. But why? What could Richard have possibly done to attract this kind of attention? "Richard has nothing to do with this," Marcus said, his voice firm. "If you've got a problem with me, leave him out of it." The man's laugh echoed through the phone, cold and sinister. "Oh, he's got more to do with this than you know. But don't worry, you'll see soon enough. This is far from over." With that, the call ended, leaving Marcus more confused and unsettled than ever. The man had made it clear that Richard was somehow involved, but Marcus couldn't begin to understand how. Richard was just a retired teacher, a blind man trying to navigate the world. What could possibly connect him to someone so dangerous? Marcus's thoughts spiraled as he sipped his coffee, his eyes darting between the car outside and his phone. He knew he needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to start. The one thing he was certain of was that he couldn't let this man continue to threaten him or Richard. As the night wore on and the streets outside grew quieter, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't just sit around and wait for the next move. He had to find out who this man was and why he was targeting them. And the only way to do that was to talk to Richard, to find out if there was something in his past that could explain all of this. With a plan forming in his mind, Marcus finished his coffee and left the diner, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the car. But it was gone, vanished into the night as silently as it had appeared. Marcus didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear: he was in deeper than he'd ever imagined. And whatever this man was planning, it was far from over. The next morning, Marcus woke with a sense of urgency. He knew that waiting around wasn't an option anymore. The man had made it clear that this was far from over, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Richard was the key somehow. This all connected to him. The threat wasn't just about Marcus helping a blind man, it ran deeper than that. After grabbing a quick breakfast, Marcus decided to head back to Richard's apartment. He had to get answers, and he had to make sure Richard was safe. The bus ride over felt longer than usual, his mind racing with possibilities. What if Richard knew more than he was letting on? What if the man had already gotten to him? Each thought was more unsettling than the last. When Marcus finally arrived at Richard's building, he hesitated at the entrance. His hand hovered over the buzzer for a moment before he pressed it. A crackling voice came through the speaker. "Who is it?" Richard asked. "It's Marcus," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to talk to you. It's important." There was a pause on the other end, and then the door buzzed, unlocking with a soft click. Marcus pushed it open and made his way up the stairs to Richard's apartment. His heart pounded in his chest, unsure of what he was about to uncover. Richard greeted him at the door with a warm smile, though there was a slight furrow in his brow, as if he could sense that something was wrong. "Marcus, come on in. You sound worried." Marcus stepped inside, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you know anything about a man who might be following you? He's been watching us since the day I helped you, and last night he called me. He threatened both of us." Richard's face fell, his expression turning serious. He motioned for Marcus to sit down at the small table by the window. "I was afraid something like this might happen," he said quietly, lowering himself into the chair across from Marcus. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." Marcus's stomach knotted as Richard continued. "Before I lost my sight, I had a complicated life. There were things I was involved in that I'm not proud of. People I got mixed up with. After my accident, I thought I'd left all that behind, but it seems like it's catching up with me now." "What kind of people are we talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice tense. Richard sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "It was years ago. I was a teacher, but I got involved with some folks who were doing some illegal things. Money laundering, shady deals. I was in too deep before I realized what was happening. I tried to back out, but they don't let you walk away that easily." Marcus's mind raced as Richard spoke. This was the last thing he had expected. "So, you think this guy, the one who's been following us, is connected to that?" Richard nodded grimly. "It's possible. They told me there'd be consequences if I ever tried to run or talk to anyone. I never thought they'd come after me now, after all these years." Marcus leaned forward, his voice urgent. "We need to go to the police. This is serious, Richard. They're not just watching us anymore, they're threatening to do something." "I can't go to the police, Marcus," Richard said, shaking his head. "You don't understand. These people have connections everywhere. If they find out I've talked, it'll be the end for both of us." Marcus sat back, frustration building inside him. He understood Richard's fear, but they couldn't just sit back and do nothing. "So, what do we do?" "We can't keep running. They'll find us." Richard was silent for a moment, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and determined. "There's one person who might be able to help. He's an old friend from my teaching days, someone I trusted before everything went wrong. If anyone can get us out of this, it's him." Marcus didn't have a better plan, so he nodded. "Where do we find him?" Richard reached for a small notebook on the table, running his fingers over the pages until he found the one he was looking for. "His name is Tom. He lives on the other side of town. I haven't spoken to him in years, but if he's still around, he'll know what to do." Marcus took the address, his mind already working through the logistics. "Let's go now. The longer we wait, the worse this could get." Richard stood, his face set with a grim determination. "Let's do it." The two of them left the apartment, moving quickly through the streets. Marcus kept an eye out for any sign of the man, but for now, it seemed they were in the clear. The bus ride to Tom's neighborhood was tense, neither of them saying much as the city passed by outside the window. When they finally arrived at the address Richard had given him, Marcus felt a sense of relief. The building was old but well kept, and it didn't have the ominous feeling that had hung over the previous days. They approached the door, and Marcus knocked firmly. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a tall man with graying hair appeared. His eyes flicked between Marcus and Richard, confusion crossing his face. "Richard? Is that you?" "Tom," Richard said with a small smile. "It's been a long time." Tom ushered them inside quickly, closing the door behind them. "I never thought I'd see you again, old friend. What's going on?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then told Tom everything the man following them, the threats, and his fears that the people from his past had finally come back to haunt him. Tom listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing minute. When Richard finished, Tom leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily. "I always knew something like this might happen. They never let anyone leave clean. Can you help us?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with hope and desperation. Tom nodded slowly. "I think I can. I have some connections, people who can help us get out of town, lay low until this blows over. But it's risky. They'll be watching every move we make." "We don't have a choice," Richard said quietly. "If we stay here, they'll find us." Tom stood, moving toward the window and peering out cautiously. "All right. Give me a day to make some calls. I'll let you know when it's safe to move." Marcus and Richard spent the next few hours at Tom's place, going over the plan and trying to figure out their next steps. As night fell, Tom told them it was best to head back to Richard's apartment and pack whatever they needed. They left Tom's building, heading toward the nearest bus stop. Marcus felt a slight sense of relief, knowing they had a plan in motion, but the unease still lingered. He kept glancing around, half expecting the man to reappear at any moment. As they neared the bus stop, a sudden screech of tires pierced the quiet night. Marcus whipped his head around just in time to see a black car speeding toward them. His heart stopped. It was the same car from before. "Richard, run!" Marcus shouted, grabbing the older man's arm and pulling him toward a narrow alleyway. The car skidded to a halt behind them, and Marcus could hear footsteps pounding on the pavement as the men got out. They sprinted down the alley, the adrenaline coursing through Marcus's veins as he guided Richard through the maze of streets. But they weren't fast enough. The footsteps were getting closer, and Marcus knew they wouldn't be able to outrun them. Just as they turned a corner, two men appeared in front of them, blocking their path. Marcus stopped short, his mind racing for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The men closed in on them, their faces shadowed in the dim streetlight. "Game's over," one of them growled, pulling out a gun and pointing it at Marcus. "You should have stayed out of this." Marcus's heart raced as he tried to think of anything that would get them out of this. But before he could move, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Put the gun down." The voice was calm, authoritative. Marcus turned to see Tom standing at the end of the alley, flanked by two men who looked just as dangerous as the ones threatening them. But they weren't pointing guns. They were holding badges. The men in front of Marcus hesitated, clearly taken aback. "What the?" "I said, put the gun down," Tom repeated, stepping closer. "You don't want to do this." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was thick, and Marcus felt like time had slowed to a crawl. Then, finally, the man lowered his gun, his expression dark and furious. Tom's men moved in quickly, restraining the two attackers, while Tom approached Marcus and Richard. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice steady. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. What just happened?" Tom smiled slightly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "I made some calls. Turns out, the people after Richard weren't just criminals, they were part of something much bigger. And they've been under investigation for years. We got lucky." Richard looked stunned, his face pale as the realization sank in. "So, I'm safe." Tom nodded. "For now. They'll be taken into custody, and with any luck, their entire operation will come down." As the men were led away in handcuffs, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. Or at least, it seemed that way. But as they walked back to the bus stop, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. It was too easy, too clean. And then, just as they were about to board the bus, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the message. "You may have won this round, but it's not over." Marcus looked around, his pulse quickening. Marcus's hands trembled as he stared at the message on his phone. The words were like ice in his veins. Even though the men who had been chasing them were in custody, whoever was behind all of this still had their eyes on him and Richard. The relief that had washed over him moments before was replaced with a new wave of dread. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. He glanced over at Richard, who was leaning against the bus stop pole, clearly exhausted and rattled. Marcus didn't know whether to tell him about the message just yet. Richard had already been through so much, and dragging him deeper into this nightmare seemed unfair. But then again, Richard deserved to know the truth. This wasn't just Marcus's fight anymore. They were in this together. "I think we need to talk," Marcus said, breaking the silence between them. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" "I just got a message," Marcus said, his voice low. He handed Richard his phone, And as the older man's fingers traced over the screen, Marcus could see the fear creep back into his face. Richard's jaw clenched, and he slowly handed the phone back. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Richard asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. "No, I don't think they are. We're still in danger, Richard. Even with those guys gone, someone else is pulling the strings." Richard took a deep breath, his expression hardening. "Then we need to figure out who. We can't keep running forever." Marcus nodded in agreement. He had been thinking the same thing. Whoever was sending the messages clearly had a plan, and it was time they started figuring out what that plan was. The bus arrived, and they boarded, sitting in the back where they could talk quietly. The city lights blurred by outside the window, but neither of them paid any attention. Marcus was focused on one thing now, finding out who was behind this and why they were targeting Richard. He thought back to what Richard had told him about his past, about the illegal deals, the people he had crossed paths with. Somewhere in all of that, there had to be a clue. Richard leaned back in his seat, rubbing his temples as if trying to ward off a headache. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "There's one more person I haven't told you about. Someone who might have a grudge against me." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "A woman named Patricia," Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was involved in some of the same deals I was, but she was much more ruthless. She always blamed me for things going wrong. After I went blind and disappeared, I assumed she would move on, but now I'm not so sure." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "You think she could be behind this?" "It's possible," Richard said. "She was always good at staying in the shadows, letting others do her dirty work. If anyone had the resources to keep tabs on me and send people after us, it would be her." Marcus mulled over the idea. Patricia seemed like a good lead, but they needed more information before they could make any moves. "Do you know how to find her?" he asked. Richard hesitated. "I haven't heard from her in years, but she used to run her operations out of an old warehouse on the east side of the city. It's a long shot, but if she's still around, that's where we might find her." Marcus felt a surge of determination. They finally had a lead. "Then we go there," he said. "We confront her and get some answers." Richard didn't look as confident. "You don't know Patricia like I do, Marcus. She's dangerous. If we go after her, we have to be prepared for the worst." Marcus looked him in the eye, his voice steady. "I've come this far. I'm not backing down now." The decision was made. They would confront Patricia and put an end to this once and for all. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, but there was also a sense of resolve. This was the final step, the one that would determine whether they would be free from this nightmare. The next day, they made their way to the old warehouse Richard had mentioned. It was in a part of town that Marcus wasn't familiar with, an industrial area that looked like it had seen better days. The warehouse itself was a massive looming structure with broken windows and rusting metal doors. It looked abandoned, but Marcus knew better than to assume. They approached cautiously, keeping their heads down as they slipped inside through a side entrance. The inside was dark and dusty, the air heavy with the scent of oil and old wood. Marcus's heart raced as they moved deeper into the building, his eyes scanning every shadow for signs of movement. Just as they reached the center of the warehouse, a voice echoed from the darkness. "So, you finally came to find me." Marcus and Richard both froze. Out of the shadows stepped a woman, tall and imposing, with sharp features and cold eyes. Her hair was slicked back, and she wore a tailored black suit that made her look every bit as powerful as Richard had described. "Patricia," Richard said, his voice tense. Patricia smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You always were predictable, Richard. I knew you'd come running back to me eventually." Marcus stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "We know you've been behind the attacks." "Why? What do you want from Richard?" Patricia's smile faded, and her expression turned hard. "What do I want? I want what I've always wanted. Justice. You think you can just walk away from everything, Richard? You ruined my life, my business. Everything I built was destroyed because of your mistakes. Richard shook his head, his voice steady. We were both in that mess together, Patricia. You can't pin this all on me. Patricia's eyes narrowed. I already have. Without warning, she pulled a gun from her coat and aimed it directly at Richard. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He had to act fast. Wait, Marcus shouted, stepping between Patricia and Richard. Killing him won't fix anything. It won't undo what happened. Patricia's grip tightened on the gun. You don't understand. He took everything from me. And what will you have left if you do this? Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. You'll have nothing. Is that really what you want? For a moment, there was silence. Patricia's face softened, just for a second, and Marcus could see the pain behind her anger. But then her eyes hardened again, and she raised the gun higher. Just as she was about to pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Several men in tactical gear burst through the doors, guns drawn. They surrounded Patricia in seconds, disarming her before she had a chance to react. FBI. One of the agents shouted. Hands where we can see them. Patricia was stunned, her eyes wide with shock as she was handcuffed and led away. Marcus let out a long breath, his body finally relaxing as the tension drained from his muscles. It was over. This time, for real. As the agents cleared the scene, one of them approached Marcus and Richard. We've been tracking Patricia for a while now. Thanks for leading us to her. Richard looked shaken, but relieved. I didn't know it would end like this. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. It's over, Richard. We're safe now. The agent nodded. You two should lay low for a while, just in case. But I think you've seen the last of Patricia. As they left the warehouse, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city. Marcus and Richard walked in silence for a while, both processing everything that had just happened. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all behind them now. After what felt like an eternity, Richard finally spoke. Thank you, Marcus. I don't know what I would have done without you. Marcus smiled, though there was still a lingering sadness in his eyes. We got through it together. That's what matters. They made their way back to Richard's apartment, the weight of the past few days slowly lifting off their shoulders. As they sat down in the small living room, Marcus realized that, despite everything, he had no regrets. He had done the right thing, and that was enough. I guess we both learned something, Marcus said after a long pause. Richard nodded, his face thoughtful. Yeah. Sometimes you can't run from your past, but you can choose how you face it. Marcus couldn't have said it better himself. The two men sat in silence as the night fell, each lost in their own thoughts. They had been through a lot, but in the end, they had come out stronger. As Marcus stood to leave, Richard stopped him. You're a good man, Marcus. Don't forget that. Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Neither are you, Richard. Take care of yourself. With that, Marcus stepped out into the night, the cool breeze brushing against his face. For the first time in days, he felt at peace. The danger was over, and life could finally move on. As he walked down the quiet street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, half expecting another ominous message. But it wasn't a threat this time. It was a simple message from Richard. Thank you. Marcus smiled and put the phone away, walking into the night with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in a long time. The story had come to an end, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever.